Thanks for tuning in to Stay Sharp with Razorleaf, your secret weapon for all things digital and manufacturing. In today's episode, Jonathan and Jen are joined by Michael Craffey, one of Razorleaf's long-standing consultants, to discuss the role of infrastructure for organizations deploying technology. One thing is for sure, much has changed in this area, and it is evolving more quickly than ever. Mike and Jonathan recount the past when it was all physical hardware, to today when you can scale up and deploy quickly using third-party services. Mike shares his insights on what considerations you need to be making when it comes to deploying infrastructure to support technology today. Let's listen in.
Welcome back, everybody, to Stay Sharp. This is a podcast about all things digital related to products and manufacturing. And today we're asking and hopefully answering the question, is infrastructure still relevant to PLM? It's a valid question. A lot has changed over the last few years, and we'll go through some of that as well. But does that mean we don't have to worry about infrastructure anymore? Or does it mean that we have to worry about it even more? With us today to dig into that topic is our friend and colleague, Mike Craffey. Mike has been implementing PLM systems for almost 2 decades here at Razorleaf, and over that time has seen the infrastructure landscape evolve quite a bit. So he's the perfect guest to be joining us for this discussion. Mike, before we jump in to the topic today, you want to introduce yourself, talk a little bit about who you are and what you do here at Razorleaf?
Sure. Thanks, Jen. My name's Mike Craffey. I live in Northeast Ohio. Prior to joining Razorleaf, I worked in the reseller channel for about 18 years, basically doing what I do here, deploying CAD and PDM systems. And I joined Razorleaf back in 2006 as a principal consultant, primarily involved in doing project management and consulting. And then over the years, my role has sort of changed to be more focused on solutioning and infrastructure deployment, and of course, consulting in general.
Mike, I can't tell you how excited I am that we're talking about this today. So, hey, everybody, again, I'm here too. I'm
so excited that Mike was here. I totally forgot about you, Jonathan.
It's fair. It's a fair thing to be excited about. But this is a fun topic, Mike. I mean, I think you've forgotten more about IT infrastructure as it relates to digital stuff than I ever knew. So I'm glad we're talking about this. I think this is a really still very relevant topic. I've got my answer already on your question, Jen, but I think it's good to dig into, because a lot is changing. And I'm going to jump right in, right? I mean, I want to dig into, well, why would we even ask the question, is IT infrastructure still relevant? And I think it comes from the fact that it's changed so much, right? When I think about the, IT stuff that's behind applications like PDM and PLM and other digital tools, so much has changed, right? I mean, when we were getting started doing this years and years ago, when you and I were starting together, and even before that, when you were doing work for many years, it looked different. I mean, let's start there. What did it look like? What was infrastructure related to these digital systems 20, 30, 10 years ago? I mean, that kind of time frame. What was it like?
Well, that's a good question. It varied. You had your traditional data centers, right? I got a company. We have a data center, our 4 walls. We buy our computers, we hook them all together, and we connect machines, and we have networks, to even smaller companies that, hey, we got a closet and we have a Windows server tower we stuck in the closet, and we ran some RG59 cable around the shop and connected some computers together. So the certainly infrastructure has changed dramatically, especially, used to be big companies had one form of data centers and infrastructure, and small companies had another form of data centers and, infrastructure. Nowadays, I don't think it matters whether you're big or small. Your infrastructures can all look pretty much the same.
Yeah, things have really changed in that, and I think that's part of what we want to talk about today. But like you said, back then, I don't want to put a definitive time range on it, but you had servers for sure, right? There was a physical box in a data center or in a closet, and even I'll update both of us. You could probably go back to before we had PDM, before we had networks. Sometimes it was just machines, right? Just computers, workstations, specialized hardware that you ran this stuff on. But
I can go back even farther. We had the company I worked in had a room of VAX VMS machines.
Yeah,
it had to be cold, it had a false floor, and it's.
That's right. Yeah. That's right. The false floor for all the cabling and wiring. Mm-hmm. But at that point, it's good to remember our history, where we came from, because back when that was the case, I mean, Mike, how much time did you have to spend talking to people about hardware and picking the right hardware, and sometimes hardware coupled with software? I mean, what was that like then? It was a big part of the projects, right?
Yeah, I mean, it was a big stumbling block on a lot of projects, because you'd be talking with one part of the organization and getting ready to make decisions about what software they were going to buy. And then, I'll stop, because now we got to go drag IT into this conversation. How many servers do we need? And how much storage is it going to be? And what kind of networking requirements are we going to have? And is this going to connect to our mainframe, or is this not going to connect to our mainframe? And then, all your sales momentum, it's just like halted. And some projects were stopped because they didn't have infrastructure.
There's a piece of that too. I don't think was as big a part of the picture, but I'm curious to get your take on this back then. And that was security. I mean, how often did security come into the conversation back in that world?
Never. I mean,
except for putting a lock on that closet door.
That's right. I mean, it was access to the data center, right? I mean, if you didn't, everything was secured in the data center, and it was our four walls. I think, Jonathan, you had sort of a saying about build a moat around your castle, sort of security, and that's really what it was. So we never talked about security,
right? Physical security was enough. Like, it's in our closet, it's fine, right?
That's right.
Or maybe antivirus. Maybe that came up, but that was about the size of it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, that didn't really get any serious traction until the love bug came around. So Y2K started something, and then love bug really made everybody stand up and take notice.
So what changed? I mean, if that's what the world was, and I remember probably the tail end of some of that. I know I did some installations of PDM systems sitting in a server closet. Wishing somebody would turn the heat up because it was freezing cold, because that was going to make the servers run better. Yeah. But what happened? I mean, in your view, we're getting to something different now, right? And we'll debate about how relevant all this infrastructure still is. But what made us start to change?
Well, I think there were a couple of things that affected the sort of a shift in infrastructure. One was certainly economics. I mean, there was some pressure to outsource IT to, hey, we need to decrease costs somehow. Hey, we can shift this hardware over to another provider, basically taking your data center and putting it into somebody else's data center as sort of a cost savings, like a rack space, for instance.
Right, because somebody else has already got a room that's cool, and they've got a room that's got power, and it's got a backup generator outside in case the power fails. So yeah, shared services kind of thing was a piece of this.
Yep, and for some there was some risk management involved. If your data center was in New Orleans, for instance, and you had an opportunity to move your data center someplace that was going to be less impacted by hurricanes, that might be worth it to you to take on that cost, or to shift that cost, so to speak. And then you had, like, when I first started at Razorleaf, we actually did co-locate servers. There was an old AT&T, it's an AT&T facility that had space, and we could rent power and a network connection, and just stick our physical server into that data center. So that's basically all we did. We took physical, still unphysical, and we moved it to another place. And then we started introducing managed services. So somebody else was like monitoring our servers and that sort of thing. It wasn't for everybody. I mean, the idea, that your data was going to be, somehow, secured and managed by somebody other than your company, that that's a complete shift in mindset.
I love how managed services started off as, hey, can you go hit the reset button for me? I'm down here and the server's in the closet up there. Can you go hit that button? Like that was the beginning of managed services.
There next Tuesday, so he'll be able to turn everything back on.
Right.
So, but yeah, I mean, and the economics, I think, changing from sort of a CapEx, way of looking at the world to an let's decrease our OpEx and, shift some of that cost around. And of course, there were companies that there were other things that attributed to this. One was companies like Rackspace were actually providing this kind of a service, and also offering their own expertise. So you could actually talk to somebody about, hey, I do need this kind of compute power. Oh, well, we can put a 2U in the rack for you. Mm-hmm. Or you just need a 1U and we'll have a NAS over here that will connect to that. Or if it's direct attached storage, we'll do that too. But really the performance of the internet actually helped with a lot of that too. I mean,
hold on. Don't get too far down that path. Go ahead, Jen.
I have a question also about the, when you're talking about the economics, how much did the type of data and the amount of data that we're storing drive the economics as well, right? Because it wasn't like because we started storing simulation data, and then eventually, we moved now into all of the Internet of Things and storing all of that. There's just so much data. It had to have been like economically not feasible to have all of those, to own all of that equipment.
You would be right. I mean, but there was a time when we were talking about just like sort of co-locating or Rackspace, just like sort of moving our mm-hmm. data center to another facility. Doesn't really solve that problem, right? I mean, you still have it might even exacerbate a little bit. Well, gee, how do I get that amount of data over there? All my scientists are right here, and so you start to have this concept of sort of a hybrid infrastructure where some of it's on premise and some of it's someplace else, because it's just not feasible to move that sort of data around, or even store it. And then, of course, I don't know how far in the future we're going to go here, or how far back, but when Amazon first started providing their services, I mean, they're basically renting their excess capacity to people. And you want 2 terabytes, you want 100 terabytes, you want, no matter how much storage you want, well, we can give it to you as long as you're willing to pay for it.
Yeah, their excess capacity was, a little bit of excess for them was like huge to everybody else. But before we go there, that's where I wanted to jump in. Before we get to cloud, you mentioned something really important, I think, Mike, which was a driver for some of this. And that was the difference between CapEx and OpEx, right? So I'm talking about capital expenditures and operational expenditures. And a lot of companies that we worked with, right, they budget in very different ways. If you're looking to buy something like a PLM system that's going to last 5-10 years, whatever, you have to put it in the capital budget, and those get looked at a certain way, right? And you get a certain amount allocated for them if you're in the IT group or the engineering group or whatever. And then operational expenses, all right, what do we pay people? What do we pay for things on an ongoing basis? Services we need, keeping the power on. That was a different budget. You look at it a different way. And what you just said a minute ago, like about Rackspace, was the first opportunity for people to shift that. And I saw it. I remember seeing it back in early PLM deals where somebody would say, I need a PLM system, but all this hardware and the servers I need and everything, that's going to be kind of expensive. I don't know if I can get all this budgeted in 1 year. And they would start to think creatively and say, well, but if I actually use servers from Rackspace or something like that, well, I'll pay monthly. I'll pay for the server power or the storage or the whatever. I'll pay for that monthly, which makes it an operational expense. So I can put some of that in that budget. And then maybe I still need to buy the software on the capital expense. And, they could just start to look at things differently. And to your point, with shared services that are billed monthly, there's a new path, a new way of looking at these things. And I think that drove some things. I mean, I don't know. Do you feel like that was part of what helped the shift?
I think it was that. And there was a big, I can't remember, the year that we really started to see a lot of it, but the, offshoring of IT, mm-hmm. Personnel and responsibilities, I think all that sort of occurred rather at the same time.
But thinking about things as a service, that's maybe what started to get us to the point you were digging into, right? So I interrupted. Back to what you were saying about cloud, like it was had the sort of a natural evolution of some of this.
Mhm. Yeah, but to your point about some of the drivers there, I remember working with some of these startup companies that look, we have big aspirations for our digital engineering, and we can't afford a data center, or we don't have the infrastructure for a data center, so we have to put it someplace else. And Rackspace was one of those places that hey, we can put it on Rackspace, and we can get budget for that, and it'll be a monthly thing. So there were a few things that sort of impacted whether somebody was going to use remote infrastructure or keep it in their data centers.
So that's a great point about shared infrastructure too, and shared services, right? It lowers the entry point on costs, which let us see some new things or creative things in the industry. It ties back to what you were saying a minute ago, Jen, right? Which is small businesses might not have been able to do advanced things like simulation or things, big graphics things, whatever things took specialized hardware and you had to invest in the whole machine. Well, when we changed it to there's one that you can share, okay, that looks different, right? That means that smaller companies, smaller organizations can get into the game in a big way early.
Right. Yeah. I mean, when I was in the world of engineering, and you did your work, whether you were doing it manually or you doing it on a computer, it was just you doing your thing. And collaboration wasn't a thing, so all of a sudden when companies, we need to have a design team, and that design team is made up of people that are in more than one location. Well, now your infrastructure has to start to get creative. You're going to deal with things like performance and security and that sort of thing.
That's a good reminder about some of the things that have popped up because with co-location, with starting to get to cloud, new opportunities that you have, like you said, if I can rent a data center or rent a share or services or whatever close to all these people, I can have a global team. Wait, I never would have thought of that before, right? And suddenly there's a new opportunity that drives new innovation, that kind of thing. Like another one that comes to my mind, I know you've had some experience with this one, graphics virtualization, right? We deal with a lot of heavy graphics data in the work that we do. What did you see there? Like what happened that's changed in that world?
Yeah. So we had, especially in the modeling world, right, where everybody wants to build. It's not enough to hey, I built a box and I spun it around. Hey, look at that. 6 polygons. Woo. And so the modeling became more complex. The capability of modeling became more complex, and so therefore hardware had to evolve to actually be able to do those sorts of things. And then people like NVIDIA and AMD, they came up with creative ways to, hey, you know what, we can not only virtualize GPUs, but we could sell you a GPU machine, put it at your facility, and you guys could share it between 5 or 10 designers. So you don't have to have $5,000 graphics card in one person's machine. You have a $50,000 GPU that you share. Well, not just one GPU, but you share it between all those people. And now you can actually get that kind of capability, I'll say on the cloud, but offsite, virtually.
Right. Yeah, I remember those days of. You mentioned some names. I remember buying graphics cards of companies that went out of business. Evans and Sutherland.
Silicon Valley.
Yeah, I mean, but they were like you had to focus on that. It's back in the day, like we were talking about at the beginning, how you had to focus on hardware. And to your point, now it's shared services, even in graphics, and that's kind of a specialized thing in our industry, I think, because we do deal a lot with 3D and models and that sort of thing. But these days you can share that also. Now, as we talk about these changes and kind of what can be different now and how we've gotten here, I stopped you on cloud a couple times. Let's talk about cloud. What When cloud became available, why, I feel like engineering and manufacturing didn't really jump on it at first. Why not? And what's gotten us there? What's made that okay?
Well, I'll start sort of more in the past, and I'll stop at a big thing that occurred back in 2020, and then we'll move forward from there. But there's a lot of sensitivity to perception of how secure something is, how secure data is. And we had customers that were quite paranoid about their IP. They would disable the USB ports on their computers because they thought somebody would stick a thumb drive in there and walk off with it.
It's still that way with our defense customers, right?
Sure. Yeah. And so when companies started to look at cloud or moving their data outside of their data center, right? So you do this in sort of baby steps. I believe it began really with a lot of startups that only had they didn't have a choice to have a data center and secure their data or whatever. So we're gonna take advantage of the cloud, and you saw some of these companies get really big really fast, and take advantage of that. And one person talks to another person, and pretty soon you have and I'll talk about this non-defense, non-ITAR type companies who begin to get okay with a company's ability to provide security of their data in such a way that they can make a shift. They can shift their data center to the cloud. AWS, for instance, will say that. There were other ones. Jonathan, you and I were just talking about a customer that back quite a ways ago. They had a virtual, hey, swipe your credit card and go provision servers. And you and I sat there and went, wow, that was unbelievable. These servers were up in, minutes.
Right.
But back to security. So I think that there were, the ability for a provider to prove that the data was secure. And then folks like you and I, we became more confident about that technology and be able to help our customers understand, hey, your data is secure, and let me tell you why. And we could help them understand why their security concerns were. It's good to be concerned, but you can verify it, and you can do your own tests if you want.
Yeah, well, it was really like it was a trusting relationship, right?
Well, and I was going to say, I think that's, the general public has become more and more comfortable with that. Because I remember going into talking to people about I'm not sure about my data on the cloud. I'm like, really? Do you use online banking?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's what I was just
saying. That's your money. That's directly your money. It's on the cloud. Yeah,
so places like Amazon and just the number of things you do online, I think has gotten sort of the level of people, the people that are willing to say, well, I guess it's okay, is an important part of that.
I remember somebody saying this to me in that process, like that conversation you were just talking about, Jen. Mm-hmm. And me saying, this was back when I think I was skeptical of this idea and being like, well, but with security, I'm just not sure. And the person said to me, they're like, so for your average customer, how many security professionals do they have on staff? I thought about it and I was like, well, usually it's one guy who's a specialist in the IT department who's that. And they said, yeah, you know how many Amazon has? They have a whole department.
Probably several departments.
Several departments, and it's like, oh, you bring up a good point, So yeah, it's been a process.
I'll bet each of those departments knows more than my one guy.
Right. No. And the whole 7-layer security thing, is now sort of everybody sort of understands that and they apply it.
But the physical moat isn't enough, right? That you need to do more.
That's right. And we have, we had a big sort of an episode with COVID that drove everybody home, and all of a sudden infrastructure was a really big deal. I mean, we had customers that had, global operations that were racing to virtualize servers so that they could, deal
Continue
with
working.
people at home, working from home, right? And no longer was it, every once in a while, Bill and Tom, they work from home and they just VPN in, or they go, they RDP to a server and then they can use their thing, it's not super effective, but, they can still work when they're at home. To holy moly, our entire organization is at home,
Right.
so that really emphasized the fact that infrastructure is super important, and the infrastructure that is available was pretty resilient. I don't remember Amazon complaining too much about this new load or Azure or whatever. Yeah. But for sure, point. Amazon was the king and Azure was sort of the little brother, but Azure's grown up quite a bit.
But you answered the question right there, though, Mike, right? Which is like, all right, COVID, we figured out, yes, infrastructure does matter. It still matters, right? Even in the world of cloud, and cloud continues to evolve, like you just said, but for sure, it's still important because people had to address it and shift things as part of the pandemic. And, we can all be certain that nothing in the future will be exactly as it is today. So when the next shift happens, is this still going to matter? I mean, so let's dig into that for a minute, right? I mean, I know we could talk about this topic all day. We don't have infinite time here, but and I think we should probably come back to this because there's a lot to dig into. But just on that point of, so what about now, right? We talked about where we started and how we've changed and some of what caused us to change. But where we are now, what's still relevant for infrastructure? Like, what do we need to think about, whether it's a PLM system we're trying to deploy or something else digital related to digital products? What kind of stuff is on your mind, on our customers' minds? What do we need to talk about?
Well, there is one topic I didn't mention before, and maybe we can sort of weave it in here now, or we can talk about it separately. But software as a service. I mean, we've been talking about like, hey, move your infrastructure to cloud, and it's still, you're basically taking an on-premises installation of something and you're just moving it someplace else. Mm-hmm. It's not really, software as a service, right?
Right.
And cloud is kind of cloudy. What is cloud? But I think we can all agree with, Salesforce was a big game changer for companies. Companies could get into the cloud market and SaaS in particular without exposing a lot of IP, just customers and customer relationship management. Not that that's not important. That's really important.
It depends on which department you're talking to about whether that's IP or not.
But it's not, it's not like their product IP is not out there. And I think Salesforce really got a lot of companies okay with this idea that, hey, we can go have these subscription model solutions and be productive as an organization globally. And that sort of opened up quite a few things. There's not as much. I mean, I can only think of a few, true SaaS models on the PLM side. But it certainly opens up a lot of possibilities for this whole what's relevant now sort of topic.
Yeah. I mean, it's like what you were talking about earlier when we got to shared services and that sort of thing. That's been an evolution. There's shared infrastructure, right, which is kind of our topic. But you bring up a good point, which is, well, there's more to that stack than just the infrastructure. There's the application. There's all the pieces. How do you buy the licenses? Are they a subscription license? That kind of thing. And all of that impacts that ability to change the market in the way that some of this stuff has, to say, well, it's fine for small companies. You could be a startup of one and go out and buy or rent or however you want to look at it, but use these digital applications in a way that 20 years ago, no way. You had a startup cost, like for that same kind of computing power, capability, whatever you want to call it, all the way up to the application itself. You were talking a couple $100,000 to get started, right? Yep. And now it's like, all right, credit card, log in, Console. Let's go. Yeah, I mean, it's totally different. And so you mentioned SaaS. what's different there, right? I mean, what's different about those things that you're talking about? How does that relate to infrastructure?
Yeah, so that's a good. In if you don't mind, I'll mention one particular vendor, Dassault, for instance.
Sure.
Their 3D experience, cloud offering. Essentially, if for the listeners that have deployed PLM, let's just say, or any enterprise solution, I mean, the effort it takes to build multiple infrastructure, environments, install software, right size it if you have load balancing and all kinds of other things that are going on, redundancy, and then, maintain it, and then usually in those situations, there's not an upgrade on the horizon for a long time, right? And maybe never, right? Now, you take a pure cloud, like a software as a service, like Dassault's cloud offering, and you don't worry at all about infrastructure. Not in the traditional sense, right? Dassault's providing all that infrastructure, the management of that infrastructure, the delivery of the services, and you pay a subscription fee. Now, infrastructure-wise, though, you still got people either in your building or working from home. They've got to have their own workstation. It's got to have you got to have good network bandwidth. Now what's important is really network bandwidth and latency. It can't be, we've got somebody, sitting over in, some remote location in Wyoming, with a really bad internet connection. That person is not going to be super efficient, with all the great, infrastructure that is delivered on Amazon, for instance.
My 3G hotspot isn't going to cut it.
No, not normally. And depends on what you're doing. Just getting email, that's one thing. But if you want to, take advantage of the GPU in your $10,000 workstation, not so much. So the ability to take advantage of the sort of a SaaS offering doesn't mean that you won't have infrastructure concerns, especially if you're doing sort of advanced things. Like, say you have HPC, high performance compute. So I've got a bunch of scientists or simulation folks, but I can't get an HPC on Amazon, for instance. But I bought one. I spent $1 million. It's sitting right here in my data center, and so the ability for Dassault to provide simulation services and take advantage of your HPC sitting in your data center is a big deal. So now you have this hybrid infrastructure. Some of it's delivered over here, but it's connected over there, and you're taking advantage of this HPC over here. Oh, and my licenses are managed in another location, in Boston or on the West Coast. And so infrastructure now becomes super complex in terms of the way you can connect things together to maximize either performance or efficiency.
So I don't want to cut us off. I mean, I know we're probably getting close to time, Jen, but I want to summarize what you just said. It feels like a little bit of a summary for overall what we're talking about today. And that is, okay, a lot has changed in the infrastructure landscape. It's made a lot of new things possible. It's saved a lot of people money. It's enabled capabilities that weren't there. But the reality of it is, it means that infrastructure matters just as much now as it ever did, because all those new options mean complexity, mean new choices, new possible combinations. Like you just said, now I got to figure out, maybe I didn't move all cloud or all SaaS or stay all on-prem, or I didn't do one of those in total, but I've got some hybrid. Now I got to sort that out, and I've got to protect that, and I got to manage that, and et cetera, et cetera. I mean, is that what you're getting at?
Yeah. And, there's almost no problem that can't be solved. There's almost no infrastructure problem that can't be solved in our landscape today because of how, I'll say, yeah, well, what is offered, what's being offered, and the fact that you can connect these things together with good, high speed, internet connections. You couldn't do all that stuff 20 years ago because maybe you had one thing, but you didn't have all 6 things.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
You know, now I can't think of something that you can't do. You know, you just have to be creative about the way you do it.
It really does raise the importance, though, of planning that out and maintaining that architecture, right? Because I mean, I'm just thinking back to the beginning of like when you had your closet and all the cords, right? And how they, like, if you weren't careful, walking in there and trying to do anything was impossible because all of it, you know, it was a hot mess. This is like a hot mess that you can't even really see. You know?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, you have virtual switches and that moat that Jonathan talks about, that thing's virtual. Nobody sees it, you know? And so I think you have to realize that, you know, the things that you can do today are very different. And I think we should all admit that, you know, our infrastructure in the past did evolve. It just evolved very, very slowly. It's just infrastructure now is evolving very, very quickly. And so you can't just like, oh, hey, we built our infrastructure and we're done. No. You built your infrastructure. Now, when that's done, now you have to actually start thinking about what it's going to evolve into in the near future. This isn't, we used to think, oh, hey, you know, we have to think about 5 or 10 years. If you're thinking 5 years out, you're going to get passed by. I mean, 5 years is too far out.
I mean, it goes right back to that point you made earlier, Mike, right? We used to think that long because it was capital equipment and it depreciated for 5 years. And so you said, we're not going to get to buy another one for 5. And all that concept is gone, right?
Well, I think, but it's something even a little bit more than that. It's that there is the pace of change has increased so much that you couldn't, even if it was all capital, like you couldn't afford to keep up. Because it used to be like things changed slowly. So you had your workstations, and that was good for maybe 5 years, maybe 10 years. But now it's not good for beyond 2.
Yeah. And having time to react is an important thing. I mean, and now you see, you know, Boston Dynamics with dancing robots. I mean, there is no time to stop. You have to keep constantly evolving and looking at ways to solve an infrastructure problem. Whatever that, everybody has infrastructure problems. Anybody says, "Oh, we don't have infrastructure problems," you're probably talking to the wrong person. But every company has some sort of an infrastructure challenge, and it's, you know, they have to constantly deal with it.
So what I'm hearing you saying, Mike, is that infrastructure is basically it's changed. It's still infrastructure. It is a different, our definition of infrastructure, if you will, has changed. Where it used to be more hardware based, now it is a lot more of it is outsourced. The importance of one of the things you had touched on recently was the time to react. And to give yourself the time to react, you need to really focus on what your core expertise is and let professionals do the things that, like the other pieces that are supportive of what you're doing, but not necessarily a piece of your expertise. So
exactly. I mean, companies are in business to make a product, not to worry about, you know, infrastructure that people use to make that product.
Right. And but it's a tricky message, right?
It is, but I mean, the more complex it gets, the more you're going to have to rely on somebody else.
Yeah. And what I mean by tricky message is, on one hand, you want to focus on what you're good at and leave the rest to somebody else. But by the same token, part of what you're saying, Mike, is also you can't ignore it, right? You have to pay attention to it, make sure you're getting it right. Understand what your requirements are, and that the person that you're handing it to, whether it's your IT person inside or some service provider, is that they know what you need and you're matching the solution to what you need. So it's different. It's easier, but in some ways you still have to pay attention to it. I mean, that's what I'm hearing.
Easier, but less direct control.
Well, it makes companies like Razorleaf is an opportunity to offer advice and to provide guidance. I mean, and companies have, you know, they struggle with how much they should pay attention to these kind of things. How often should I look at what we can do with cloud or Amazon or Azure? And, oh, well, gee, we didn't even talk about, you know, defense and ITAR and FedRAMP and all those other things that are that are infrastructure related, right?
You're right. There is a lot to talk about. And I know we are about at time. Jonathan did a really good job a few minutes ago, kind of summarizing. So kind of the content of today. And I would just say in general, infrastructure, our definition has changed. The details of that have changed. The complexity of the challenges has only grown, and it continues to accelerate. There's a lot more. I feel like there's a lot more to talk about here. Infrastructure is certainly relevant. We've answered that question. Yes, infrastructure is relevant. Our definition of it has changed, but it's still relevant. So
I think that's exactly right, Jen. I'll ask now, Mike. Can we come back to this? I think there's a lot more to talk about here. Like things we didn't touch on when we got into SaaS, right? You mentioned virtualization a couple times. There's containerization in Kubernetes and all kinds of tech that's happening today that is relevant. And I think our audience might just want to understand at a high level some of those things. There's all these options today, like you mentioned. What do some of them mean? What do you need to pay attention to if you're a technology buyer or you're thinking about a project, that kind of thing? And I don't know. Can we come back to this? Can you come back and talk to us more about some of those things?
Sure.
Awesome.
Come back and help our listeners navigate the PLM infrastructure landscape these days.
That's right. We didn't even talk about security, and hey, how do you secure people before they get into your network?
Yeah. Good times.
I think he's angling to be like a regular guest, not just like one or two podcasts, but a regular guest.
I'll come back at least one more time.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Mike, for joining us. And thank you, Jonathan, for being here to co-host with me. I want to remind our listeners, if there's any questions that you had on this episode, anything you felt that we didn't touch on, or just other topics that you want us to explore, please reach out, let us know, be part of the conversation. Don't forget to subscribe to the podcast on whatever platform you're listening to us on. And until next time, stay sharp.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Stay Sharp with Razorleaf. We appreciate you. If you have any questions for our podcast team or have an idea for a new topic for our team to cover this year, please send an email to podcast@razorleaf.com. We would love to hear from you. Also, leave a comment on our post and don't forget to subscribe to our podcast on your favorite podcast platform. Until next time, stay sharp.